I'm joined on TVP World by the United States Ambassador to Poland, Mark Brzezinski, to remember the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, whose state funeral takes place in Washington on Thursday. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for welcoming us.
John, welcome to the U.S. residence in Warsaw, Poland.
Well, as I mentioned, we're here to remember President Carter and his role the role he played in Poland's struggle for freedom and the end of communism. But first, could you tell me about the Jimmy Carter that you knew? Your father, Zbigniew, worked as his national security advisor. When did you first meet President Carter, and what did you make of him?
Well, I first heard the name Jimmy Carter when my father, a Polish immigrant to America, began working on his campaign in late 1974. My father, with David Rockefeller, had set up the Trilateral Commission, a think tank basically, bringing the leaders of Europe, America, and Asia together. Then Governor Carter of Georgia was invited to join the Trilateral Commission, and my father recommended to Governor Carter that he run for the U.S. presidency after the Watergate scandal. My father saying that Carter would be the perfect antidote to follow Nixon and the impeachment of the early 1970s. I first met President-elect Carter soon after the 1976 elections, but let me share with you, John, when I really got to know Jimmy Carter. And that is when my father and his family, including me, were invited to Camp David for a weekend. And we spent a weekend with the Carters in Camp David in Maryland. And we watched movies together in the cabins on the Camp David compound. We did skeet shooting. We did all kinds of fun things that weekend. And President Carter, the President of the United States and the leader of the free world, so engaged my sister, my brother, and me. For example, I remember we watched the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And after the movie, President Carter questioned me about what I thought of the movie and what my impressions were and so forth. And I was 12, 13 years old, and I just thought that was an incredibly generous and kind and real thing to do for a young person, for the President of the United States to engage, basically someone he didn't have to engage on his thoughts of a movie. I thought was personally very kind. That was Jimmy Carter.
The late president has credited your father with educating him about the inner workings of the Soviet Union. What did President Carter make of the injustices suffered by Eastern Bloc countries, including Poland, under communism?
Well, he thought, human rights was the clarion call for the Carter administration, the Carter Doctrine, which informed the blueprint of America's engagement with the world during the Carter administration, used human rights as its moral anchor. And Soviet totalitarianism, crushing the human rights of the citizens of Eastern Europe, was something reprehensible to President Carter, but also an opportunity to undercut the superpower challenge that the USSR presented to the United States. So one of President Carter's very first trips abroad as president-elect was to Poland. And he came here to speak about human rights to then communist Polish authorities. And then during that trip, he quietly had the First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter, and my father, his national security advisor, Polish-born Zbigniew Brzezinski, meet with Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński here in Warsaw to talk about human rights and the struggle of the Polish people. And photographs of that meeting, First Lady Carter, my father, and Cardinal Wyszyński were telegraphed through the media around the world that when President Carter travels abroad, he supports the human rights aspirations of the people he meets.
You've described the late president as a true friend of Poland, which he, as you say, he visited in '77. Why was that visit so significant?
It was because President Carter understood how important Poland was as a country in the Eastern Bloc. The Polish people had not been crushed during the most austere phases of Soviet totalitarianism and communist imposition, that in fact they had maintained their national identity, the Polish identity, and that would be, quite frankly, a real motor train for the struggle for freedom during the communist era. Remember, President Carter came to Poland in 1977 just as the Solidarity movement was beginning to germinate in Poland. And I'll tell you, John, my father, as National Security Advisor in the late 1970s, used to come home and share with his family, us kids at the dinner table, how he would sign off on transfers of literally blocks of cash being smuggled by the CIA into communist Poland to be given to the Solidarity movement to support their activities. President Carter had Poland as its focal point, and that's why the imposition of martial law just at the end of the Carter administration was so horrific to President Carter.
Looking at that in particular, Ronald Reagan is often held up as the president that brought about the collapse of communism. But do you think that's unfair on President Carter?
Look, I think President Carter and President Reagan had great synchronicity in a set of efforts to undercut the Soviet Union that was ultimately successful. President Carter used human rights to inspire the national identity movements of the Soviet bloc, whether Polish or Ukrainian or Slovak or Romanian or Armenian. The national identities policy of the US government worked to undercut the societal underpinnings of the Soviet bloc. And President Reagan won the arms race against the Soviet bloc. The two of them contributed together to the collapse of the Soviet bloc.
Looking at President Carter's legacy, his time in office has had a long-lasting impact on a global scale. Tell me about his legacy and how the world will remember him.
The world will remember President Carter in a number of different ways. The people of Latin America will remember the respect President Carter showed to them by returning the Panama Canal to the people of Latin America. For President Carter, he didn't want just immigration and narcotics to define how we engage with our friends in Latin America. He wanted this to be a relationship on equal terms, and that's a fundamental reason why he made the step to return the Panama Canal to the people of Latin America. With regard to Asia, the rise of China and the opportunity to collaborate with China to undercut the Soviet bloc was the reason why normalization of relations between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China was initiated, and that unleashed 40 years of joint economic development. And in Eastern Europe, whether it was the strategic arms limitations talks, the SALT talks, or supporting the human rights of the people of Eastern Europe, the effort to undercut the Soviet Union was successful because of the Carter Doctrine.
I want to finally ask a personal question. How will you remember President Carter?
I will remember President Carter as the loveliest of people and the kindest of human being that you could ever meet. And I'll share this story with you in closing. I served as U.S. ambassador to Sweden for 4 years, and I was honored about 10 years ago to go to the airport in Stockholm to welcome President Carter, who was coming to Stockholm on a book tour. And I was, as ambassador in Stockholm, I was allowed to go to the plane door when I had VIPs visiting. And I remember the airplane door of a commercial airliner, I think it was SAS, opening, and I heard people cheering and applauding. And I thought it was Bono or, some great rock star coming out of the plane. But no, it was President Jimmy Carter who had gone up and down the aisles of the airplane to shake hands with anyone who wanted to shake his hand, to offer to every passenger on that plane the opportunity to shake the hand of a U.S. president. President Carter was the president of people, and that is how I will remember him.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. And thank you, Ambassador, for sparing the time to talk with us on TVP World.
Thank you. We are all proud of President Carter.
And that was my guest on TVP World, the US Ambassador to Poland, Mark Brzezinski.